Hello and welcome to My Security TV, and my name is Chris Cubbage. I'm with My Security Media. This is our Tech and Sec Weekly, our Tuesday afternoon episode, and we're going to be joined by Doug Wolfson, the Director of Financial Crime Compliance with LexisNexis Risk Solutions. He's based in Hong Kong. We're going to be looking at using AI and machine learning to combat animal trafficking. In our pre-interview discussion, it's quite a sad state of affairs, the state of animal trafficking. So we'll have a look at how advanced technology look at this particular crime type and a significant issue. So that's enough from me, and let's get into this very fascinating domain of animal trafficking and trying to sort of use advanced technology and AI and machine learning to combat this issue. We're joined by Doug Wolfson, the Director of Financial Crime Compliance with LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Doug, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a really important subject that I think from time to time ends up getting overlooked, so I'm always happy to talk about it.
Look, absolutely, and I still haven't been able to put my finger on it. Our Suresh Bana, our Mumbai correspondent, did a very interesting piece a few years ago on India and the Indian sort of illegal wildlife trade as well. But I think that was back in 2014. And I'm sure we've covered it since, but it's as we're saying, it's a crime type. It's obviously linked to other crime and organised crime syndicates, but it does stand out on its own. It's some sort of, maybe Doug, introduce yourself in terms of your role. You're there in Hong Kong with LexisNexis Risk Solutions, and maybe introduce where your company is involved in this and some of the services that you're providing.
Sure, thank you. So my role, I've been here in Asia Pacific. I've been in Hong Kong now for over 14 years in various risk roles, both in banks. I actually spent a bit of time in a cybersecurity company as well, completely unrelated to all this, but touching on what you talk about. And now here with LexisNexis Risk Solutions for nearly 3 years. And my role here is really to understand the financial crime compliance marketplace, to understand the community that's working to combat it, be it on the bank side, on the corporate side, within all the various different facets of it, to be the subject matter expert on it for LexisNexis Solutions in the region, and to, in a lot of ways proselytize about what we as a community are trying to do and speak about it, to try and get the word out about how we can stop financial crimes, how we can all work together to really reduce a lot of the risk, the financial risk that's created from it, terrorism risk that's created from it, drug risk that's created from it, and even sort of zoonotic disease risk as we're sort of going through right now. It's something that's taking front stage,
Well, look, some of the figures I've got is the annual value of animal trafficking is between 69 billion to 199 billion, and it's often an acts as a feeder crime for criminal rings and corrupt government officials. Maybe just talk, maybe hit straight back onto the AI and machine learning. What type of differences would animal trafficking have from, say, drug trafficking and even human slavery and human trafficking? How kind of different is it? What are some of those red flags and indicators that you might be looking for?
Yeah, so what's interesting about it is that in itself, wildlife trafficking is not hugely different as a concept than human trafficking or drug trafficking. You're trying to get one thing from one place to another place without people recognizing that that's the thing you're moving. You're either talking about moving something else that is legal to move from place A to place B, or you're disguising it in some way, or you're sort of making it completely disappear and make it seem like it was never moved at all. And so in that respect, it is, it isn't different from drug trafficking or human trafficking. Where it's similar to human trafficking but different from drug trafficking is that these are oftentimes living beings in terms of animals. Now, if you're talking about ivory, obviously a product from an animal that's unfortunately been killed. But if you're talking about something like pangolins, live pangolins or other animals that are pets, snow leopards, tigers, things like this, then oftentimes they're alive. And so In that way, they need to be transported in a way in which they can be kept alive during the time that they're moved, which is somewhat similar to human trafficking. Obviously, done in different ways. You really can't stick people on a cargo ship and move them around the world in that way. But the problem is that these transactions end up getting lost as a single transaction or a small number of transactions within a very large number of legitimate transactions that are happening. And this is the same thing with human trafficking and the drug trade. And so what needs to be done is really, you're not even looking for a needle in a haystack, if you will. The best way I've heard it described is you're looking for a very specific needle inside a pile of needles.
All right.
And so it's finding that one transaction that doesn't seem to fit. And the ways that you start to do that is to look for transactions that don't make sense. A lot of times this comes down to really common sense. And so you're looking for a product that's transported from place A to place B that you wouldn't normally expect to be transported from place A to place B. So, let's say you're trying to disguise a wildlife shipment as something else, as a different type of, say it's a type of wood that you're transporting from, say, Africa to India or to Hong Kong or to China. It's trying to disguise it as a different type of wood that you normally wouldn't see either starting from place A or received by place B. It's those sort of transactions, and that's really where machine learning and artificial intelligence starts to come into play, is to look at all the transactions, all the shipping transactions, all the cargo transactions that are happening between those places, and starting to understand which ones don't fit the normal bill of behavior for that shipping route.
What's the key motivation from the banking perspective for this service? I take it they engage your company to do this. Is it a compliance driven, or is it also linked to the corporate responsibility that they have? What do you find is the main driver for this? Because it's sort of the backup question to that is, what type of resources are going into this? It's not really on the radar of sort of law enforcement. They've got so many other things that they sort of combat. It tends to fall into the customs and regulation, sort of the border controls, rather than law enforcement targeting organised crime. Where do you see the key driver is to detect this?
Well, taking your second question first, if you don't mind, it's definitely starting to become a bigger and bigger issue at the forefront of banks' minds, and not just because of compliance reasons, but because of sort of corporate social responsibility reasons. The E in ESG stands for environment, and so I think companies are starting to take that a lot more seriously, because we as consumers are starting to take that more seriously, and especially sort of the millennial generation. This is something that they care about. I think every generation cares about social issues a bit more than the generation before it, I think is maybe a fair thing to say. And so, they care about things like this. And so as we start to see that, the money transfer into their responsibility, into their hands, this starts to become a bigger issue. And so that, combined with the fact that governments and regulators are starting to look more and more closely at this, are starting to pass laws about responsibility in stopping wildlife trafficking. Companies, banks are starting to take it a bit more seriously, and so we see them starting to deploy these solutions in terms of where they're doing trade finance, because obviously they're not just tracking all ships just to track ships. They're tracking, they're tracking the trade that they're financing. They are required by their regulators to do screening for financial crime, which includes wildlife trafficking, and so they are starting to look at this more closely and trying to see where they can help. I think it's more than just, oh, I have to do this, so I'm going to do this. I think we've moved we've moved past those days of just sort of doing the bare minimum to get by without a fine.
Yeah. What type of activity or methodology do you find that they're using? Are they now using it sort of the Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies as well now? And we have had some recent episodes looking at the dark net and cryptocurrency money laundering. So I'd imagine the answer is yes. And I suppose how much are they using the dark net and cryptocurrencies in this?
Well, if the number I think you gave out was 69 billion to 199 billion. So if we start with that as sort of right, that is, you couldn't have a bigger range if you had said billion to infinity, right? I mean, it's such a big range already. It's almost meaningless, right? And so to try to find in that space what amount is being laundered through cryptocurrency is even more difficult, right? And these are the problems that we're trying to solve: is how much is being laundered, how is it being laundered, what is the size, and then once you start to figure out these problems, then you can, once you understand the problem, then you can solve the problem. I think what's really interesting about cryptocurrency as a money laundering tool, and this is something that we talk about a lot in webinars, we talk a lot about with journalists to help them understand the space, is that people think it's anonymous. It's not anonymous. It's pseudonymous, which as you know, it's anonymous until somebody can connect your wallet to your name. And FATF is requiring more and more regulators as part of their mutual evaluations and the recent interpretive notes on recommendation 15, recommendation 16, that KYC and client due diligence information is collected by cryptocurrency exchanges, by people who are dealing in cryptocurrency, to make sure that these tools cannot be used as money laundering tools. And what is really interesting about it is if you can connect a criminal's physical identity, who they are as a person, that they're a criminal. If you can connect to their cryptocurrency wallet, you now know their entire Bitcoin history, their entire Ethereum history, because it's stored in the blockchain. And so right now, it's a decent tool for laundering money. But I think as these FATF requirements start to be implemented by regulators around the globe, that will become less and less so. And I think historical criminal activity might start to be found out as well, when you can start to connect the actual person to those accounts. Now, there is, and I apologize, it's a bit of a long answer, but there is the question of obviously you have to be worried about the weakest link in the chain. Criminals are always looking for the lowest common denominator, the easiest place for them to do business. And so they're going to go to regulatory environments where cryptocurrency hasn't been regulated to that extent, where they've included KYC and CDD and payment tracking and transaction tracking and all of these things. They're going to go to those environments first, and hopefully over time, those FATF will continue to highlight these in their mutual evaluations, and regulators will start to build in these safeguards against them.
Well, unfortunately, it's probably those jurisdictions that don't have those controls are also part of the ones that are vulnerable to animal trafficking, and obviously the developing nations as well. And I noticed the Asean Wildlife Enforcement Network has been set up here I've got an infographic from LexisNexis Risk Solutions. So yeah, it's an interesting one for Southeast Asia is obviously one, and obviously the African continent is another sort of key domain where, I think again it was the article from Surash that the rhino will be extinct within by 2025 or 2030, this decade. And as we mentioned in our pre-interview, the less there are, the more valuable they become, which means they're more likely to be subject to poaching. And that's a big industry on its own right as well. What type of sort of ecosystem is developing around this, and maybe it does link back to human trafficking and the slavery? Do you find that they are coming together or connected, or do you find that they are quite distinct in terms of their trade?
So I think historically there has been a real focus on drug trafficking and on human trafficking, somewhat at the expense of wildlife trafficking. And what has been interesting to see over sort of the past 3 to 5 years is that real focus on wildlife trafficking as well. And so what we've seen is public-private partnerships, along with NGOs that are all working together to try to solve this. So there are NGOs that we work with that also work with the banks, that also work with companies, that are also working with the governments to try to come together to figure out how collectively we can solve this problem. Because you're right, it's seen as an Africa problem or as a Southeast Asia problem, but really it's a global problem. I mean, if you look at, not to say that COVID-19 has happened because of animal trafficking, but zoonotic diseases do happen because of it. The next pandemic could happen because of it. And so it's a global problem. There's no question about that, that this is an issue that affects everybody. And so it's important that we all work together to solve it. I think there are essentially 3 main parts that create an environment for wildlife trafficking. And it's a developing economy or an underdeveloped economy. It is a willingness by government officials to look the other way, to maybe they're not being paid enough so the bribes supplement income. Then obviously you need the raw materials. You need the animals and the flora and the fauna that are valuable to be transported. And it's really in Southeast Asia, in Africa, where you have those 3 factors sort of coalescing, if you will, that you have the flora and the fauna there. The people who are, you mentioned ivory, rhinos, elephants. People who are poaching rhinos and elephants, the people who are actually doing the poaching generally are not part of grand criminal enterprises. They're people who are poor, who need to find a way to make money, and this is the fastest, easiest way to make money for them. And so it's that's the reason why they're doing it. So you have that factor, you have the goods that need to be trafficked, and then you have government officials who are willing to look the other way for something in return in order for it to be able to get out of the country through sort of customs officials and government officials and things like that.
So it does sound like a lot needs to be done at that local end as well, a bit like what we saw with piracy in Somalia, where the pirates, that was their way of surviving. You're going to put these big cargo ships passing through our fishing waters. We're going to come and take you. Give us another part. So there was a lot of work done locally to give them a more local economy, and that sounds like something that needs to be done at the source. Rather than just detecting it. It's always too late by the time you're detecting the trafficking side, because it's already occurred, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing more devastating than just seeing a pile of elephant tusks to be destroyed. I mean, whatever the number of tusks is divided by 2, that's the number of elephants that had for that pile to be created. It's completely unnecessary. But just to sort of give you one more example of how all of trafficking sort of coalesces, right? If you think about one of the main ways in which people are trafficked and then enslaved is on fishing boats, right? And this is in Southeast Asia. And if you think about the fact that if a fishing boat captain is willing to have someone who's been kidnapped put onto their boat and then essentially enslave them on that boat for 2, 3, 4 years and get slave labor out of them, do you think they really care about the environment or the fishing or whether they're overfishing or any of these issues? And then if they have the opportunity to transport drugs from one place to another place, because fishing boats do pass a lot more freely than other types of boats, they're going to do it. And so I think there's a real need to solve all of these problems together, which is part of what we're trying to do, rather than looking at it as distinct problems. I think syndicate. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, finish that sentence because I think you're on the right track there. The
A
criminal syndicates?
Yeah, a criminal syndicate is going to make money transporting whatever is the easiest thing to transport. And so whether it's drugs, people, wildlife, it's all the same criminal syndicate.
Yeah, and I think once you get to that scale that we're talking about, is people play their part within that syndicate. So, there's people doing the trafficking part. They get very good at the trafficking. They can get from A to B. They probably don't even know what they're trafficking most of the time. They just know they've got to get that package from here to there without being detected, or to circumvent normal detection. And that's their job, whereas the others, both at the buyer and the seller end. Maybe just to finish off, and conscious of time, is the actual AI and machine learning being used, and I've got some here in terms of institutionalizing financial workflows around the red flags and risk indicators. Then you've got file suspicious activity reports to document trafficking risks, blacklist individuals or companies found to be participating in wildlife trafficking, conduct ongoing monitoring against current sanctions and politically exposed person and adverse media intelligence, promote and participate in private-public partnerships. You've mentioned that. There's the United for Wildlife Financial Task Force, and make an ongoing commitment to play an active role in combating wildlife trafficking. I mean, it even happens here in Australia, particularly with our wildlife as well, particularly birds, reptiles, and the smaller animals as well. Maybe just talk us through, to finish off, the monitoring against sanctions and politically exposed persons and media intelligence. How much do you find is in that sort of game, and sort of the machine learning around that to raise red flags for those that are being monitored or doing the monitoring?
Absolutely. If we take PEPs, right, politically exposed persons, these are, politicians or people connected to politicians who have influence and can, say, let cargo pass. If you're willing to take a bribe to allow somebody to do wildlife trafficking, you're willing to take a bribe to essentially do anything. I mean, it's pretty much the case, whether at that point you're just simply willing to take the money, or you can be coerced into taking it for considerably worse things. It's very problematic. What we're looking at from our perspective is sort of a combination of digital and physical signals to understand how those people who are PEPs are behaving, right? If somebody that a bank knows is a PEP needs to give them a higher level of scrutiny than somebody who is not a PEP, for all of those reasons. And it's really about helping them understand, are they, is the money that's passing through their account legitimate? Are they controlling accounts that they say they're not? So, for instance, let's say that you opened an account, and I'm a politician in Australia, and you open an account, but then you give me the credentials and I run the account. It's understanding, once you know that somebody's a PEP, how are they behaving in a way? Does it make sense in a way that the bank would expect? Or are there red flags? Are there criminal indicators in that behavior in itself? And so there's real concern about that. In terms of the screening, it's really about understanding who the traffickers are. Anytime that they're reported in the media and it's verifiable and they're from strong sources, and this isn't Facebook or Twitter or something like that, but they're in verifiable media sources, adding them to databases to make sure that when their names are screened, it's clear that it's known that they've been connected to wildlife trafficking or any type of trafficking in the past. And then also just making sure that that the behavior that they're continuing to show makes sense versus versus what you're expecting from them. Again, it comes down to what you or I would call common sense, but in the computing world, that's what AI and machine learning is learning from the past and highlighting something that looks anomalous. Yeah. That's it's sort of a very technical way to describe common sense.
You brought up social media as well there, and even maybe back to the dark net. I take it there's often clubs. They might even be legitimate sort of clubs that we talk about birds or reptiles, and they're sort of the club or keepers or clubs for animal keepers and the like, and then they get sort of sucked into getting that rare bird or that rare species into their collection. Are the platforms involved in supporting this work as well? Platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and the like, to make sure that there is no sharing of what might be illicit animals?
So I do believe that most of the terms of service of those entities, and I'm not 100% sure, it's not actually something we've looked directly at, but is an interesting point. But I would believe that most of the terms of service of those platforms would include trafficked wildlife or endangered species as their, within their sort of illicit substances or illicit products that they would shut down if they saw it on there.
Yeah, it's something that I know that we've had the e-safety commissioner on, so they're doing it around sort of online bullying and that type of sort of sexual harassment and those types and violence. But it'd be interesting if they can start to add that on, because I imagine sort of sharing birds and reptile pictures within a collection, unless you know what you're looking for or some key words, might seem pretty harmless, but could be an indicator there that they're involved in some sort of illicit trade. So look, on that note, very interesting subject and a very important subject. So I'm very pleased that we were able to cover that, and I thank you to LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Now, before on the LexisNexis, I don't think we've covered LexisNexis before. What's the background of LexisNexis? Because it's one of those words from an Australian perspective. I know you do some really interesting work, and it's part of a larger sort of network. What's the background of the company?
So we are actually part of a group, is our parent company, which is listed in the UK, the US, and the Netherlands, and our primary listing in the UK, which owns a lot of subsidiaries, and we're very much in the data fields, but also in publishing. We publish a number of medical journals and scientific journals out of a subsidiary called Elsevier. There's our we've recently combined with another subsidiary within RELX called Acuity, who is also in this business. We have LexisNexis Legal and which is a separate affiliate which focuses on law and court cases and regulatory compliance. We have flight data. If you go online and look up when we can all fly again, look up flight data. We collect and distribute a lot of that data, oil and gas data, and also I don't know if you know Comic-Con. We used to be able to gather in groups as well. There's a subsidiary called Reed Exhibitions that actually runs Comic-Con.
Got it.
We're part of a bigger puzzle. We're a piece of the bigger puzzle. But what's great is it allows us to work with all of these different entities, be it LexisNexis Legal and Professional, on regulatory compliance and how financial crime compliance and regulatory compliance come together, or Cerium and airlines and how potentially trafficking or screening for people on airlines. A lot of that is work that we can do together, which is great to have within one entity. So
it becomes a data science play as well at a bigger level. So, look, very interesting. We have covered LexisNexis before on our channels, and as well as most of us will know Elsevier and Reed Exhibitions as well. So, very good. I'm glad you sort of reminded me of that. I think it's our first time having you on MySec TV, so thank you very much for your time. So that was Doug Wolfson, the Director of Financial Crime Compliance with LexisNexis Risk Solutions there in Hong Kong. Doug, stay safe over there, and thank you very much for joining us on My Security TV.
Thank you very much for having me. It's
Good man.
been speaking with you about it. Thank you.
Good on you. Have a good day. I'll let you go. Thanks, Doug.
You too.